Hey guys, today's video is brought to you by Keeps. Losing your hair can be a real bummer for people, especially when it's part of your signature look. 2 out of 3 guys will actually experience some form of patterned baldness by the time they're 35. But the best way to prevent hair loss is to be proactive about it while there's still hair. Keeps is a great way to treat this problem, and it's incredibly easy. Keeps allows you to skip the hassle of an in-person doctor's visit, so you can talk with a doctor online and get hair loss medication delivered directly right to your home. It's hassle-free, and you get new medication delivered to you every 3 months. And Keeps offers generic versions of the only 2 FDA-approved hair loss products out there, so you're getting approved medication at an affordable price. So, if you're ready to take action and prevent hair loss today, go to keeps.com/completionist or click the link in the box down below to receive 50% off your first order. Again, that's keeps.com/completionist. Thanks for sponsoring today's video, and enjoy the show. In a world full of remakes and remasters, there are more options than ever when it comes to revisiting games. After dedicating dozens of hours to something, it's a major act of commitment to decide to do that again, and not every game provides a lot of incentive to do so. And to me, that's what remakes are all about, giving the player a new reason to relive an old experience. But sometimes, it transforms the game so much that it basically becomes a brand new experience, and that brings me to Wild Arms. Now, I have fond memories of completing Wild Arms, the classic JRPG for PlayStation 1, but had only briefly messed around with the PS2 remake, Wild Arms Alter Code F, which I think we can all agree they should have just really called Wilder Arms. Gene Wilder's arms. Okay, maybe not that, but wasn't actually ready for how much wilder this version's arms were, and it left me thinking about that delicate balance of remaking a game between capturing the nostalgia the player might feel for the original and transforming the experience for a brand new platform. Hey everyone, and welcome to an all-new episode of the Completionist New Game Plus, the show where I am recompleting the original 120 games I ever featured here on the channel. More on that in the box down below. I'm both excited and nervous for today's game because it's kind of a weird one amongst the games I've done for New Game Plus thus far. Wild Arms Alter Code F definitely is not the first remake we've covered, but it might be the first one where it feels so different from the original experience that it barely even feels like the same game. The story and stuff is all here, but there's been a ton of things added, especially when it comes to the completion process. Now, I've had a ton of nostalgia for the original game because it was the very first Let's Play I did with Alex for Super Beard Bros. So revisiting that world and story is obviously super exciting, but it also brings all the unknowns that usually come with completing a brand new game I've never played before, especially knowing how much stuff has been added with this completion process. It's the wildest arms, my dudes. My arms have never been this wild. They're even wilder than Gene Wilder.
And the battle continues. This could turn it all around. This bout will determine who is the strongest once and for all.
Wild Arms is one of those series that achieved much more popularity in Japan than it did in Europe or North America. But that's not to say that there's no affection for it here. There are 5 games in the series across both the PlayStation and PlayStation 2, and Alter Code F is a recreation of the first game, using the engine from Wild Arms 4. And although the Wild Arms series tends to get lost in the conversation when compared to other, more popular RPGs like your Final Fantasies and your Dragon Quests, it's still easy to see why the first game sparked multiple sequels and a remake, even if its audience in the West is of the small but vocal variety. And that cult status might account for why the game can be so difficult to find and play today. PS2 copies of Wild Arms Alter Code F are very expensive and very hard to find. And even though I managed to get my hands on multiple copies, I still had to run it through an emulator because of all of the shaking and screen tearing when I tried to capture it natively on a PlayStation 2. And even at that, the emulation didn't even clearly get rid of all of the shaking, as you can tell throughout this footage here. But honestly, it was worth the effort because this game is baked into the DNA of this very show. On top of being my very first Let's Play with my Let's Play channel Super Beard Brothers, the battle theme from Wild Arms has been used in my videos for many years as what we call the struggle theme, because it's a super dope piece of music that gets me hyped. You all get to sit back right now and have that moment, that realization of, oh, that's where this song is from right now. Jumping into Ultra Code F was familiar, but also not. Released 10 years after the original, everything has been polished, from the writing down to the visuals, although the basics have remained the same, like the world and story. Wild Arms is set in Filgaia, a world that looks vaguely like medieval Europe, but with some heavy Old West vibes as well. Advanced technology is a thing of the past, buried and locked away for being too dangerous, especially the titular Wild Arms, which are basically just guns. They're not really called Wild Arms, they're called arms, but we're calling them wild because this game is wild, and guns clearly are far too wild for everyone to deal with. With the exception of our hero, Rudy Rough Knight, who knows how to wield those arms, and also has the most hilariously cool name of all time. Please treat yourself right now and say it out loud quietly. Rudy Rough Knight. Glorious. Rudy and his pals are up against a race of ancient and advanced machines known as metal demons, led by Mother, since, every RPG villain is legally obligated to be named Mother. She's been locked away for 1,000 years, but we all know that nothing lasts forever. And so, Rudy is joined in his quest by a princess named Cecilia and an adventurer named Jack, with his trusty smart rodent sidekick, Handpan. But in Ultra Code F, there are a bunch of new characters that join you. In both versions, though, the characters engage in classic turn-based RPG combat, with basically everything that usually entails. In the original game, there was a top-down 2D view perspective similar to The Legend of Zelda, which pivoted into 3D for the battles. But in Ultra Code F, it's all 3D all the time, baby. One of the signature elements of the Wild Arms series is the tools that allow characters to solve puzzles and traverse dungeons when out of combat, like the bombs or the grappling hook. Within combat, each character has a niche too, with Rudy blasting enemies with nice guns, or his arms, Jack slicing up foes with the sword and his techniques, and Cecilia doing classic spellcaster type stuff like healing and buffs. You know how that goes. Ultra Code F retains the core RPG feel of the original Wild Arms while also modifying everything around it, but nothing got a bigger overhaul than the collectibles and completion, which is the main thing I am very anxious about. There is a lot of stuff in this version of the game that isn't in the original, and I am worried that going with Ultra Code F may have been a large mistake in that regard. But on the other hand, I'm also super pumped that I get to experience a different and more polished version of a game that I already enjoyed and know and love, which is good because if my suspicions are correct, then I might get to experience it for a much longer time, which is really saying something. There comes a point in everyone's life where they have to stop, look around, and ask themselves, have my arms gotten too wild? And the answer, of course, is no. There is no such thing. Let those arms fly, baby. Completing games can create a weird friction when it comes to a remake like Wild Arms Ultra Code F. Because yes, this game adds a vast and interlocking series of collectibles that straight up doubles the amount of time required to complete. I'd argue even triples the time. But in pretty much every other way, I'd say I vastly prefer it to the original. So there's definitely an added layer of stress to this version of the game, but literally every other single change was very, very welcomed. So I want to talk about Wild Arms Ultra Code F mostly through the lens of the changes it makes to the original and how those changes mix up the overall vibe of playing this game. It all starts with the story, which I enjoyed the first time around, even if it got bogged down in some classically convoluted JRPG storytelling, with some names and translations that just made things even more confusing. The central conceit of ancient technology that's been locked away is a strong one, but it eventually leads to a secret backstory and massive super weapons hidden on the moon, because of course it does. So although I really enjoyed the constant twists and turns of the story last time, there was always a slight disconnect here. But with Ultra Code F, that's mostly been smoothed over here. The script makes a lot more sense while retaining the bonkers story mostly as I remembered it, and the world ends up feeling even larger and more vibrant thanks to the addition of so many new playable characters, like the domineering Emma, the metal demon Zed, or the unpredictable Calamity Jane. I mentioned this game has a Western vibe to it, right? Because there's literally a character named Calamity Jane. And some of those Western vibes probably come through the strongest in some of the music, which has all been either remixed or re-recorded for the game. The most notable one, outside of the battle theme that I love to use so much in our show, is probably the Filgaia theme, which samples Ennio Morricone's Ecstasy of Gold from The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. This is one of the most iconic pieces of Western music of all time, and this amped up and energetic version of it feels super dope pretty much the entire time you return to the overworld. But my absolute favorite track in this game, let alone the series, has got to be the title theme for Wild Arms. It's just so good. That whistling, that beginning, opening track is so iconic in my mind that I wish everyone had the chance to experience it. This is a banger of a track that everyone can get down with. Obviously, the biggest change to the game is the presentation here with its overhauled graphics. Traversing the world still feels very much the same, but now looks way better, which also has the added bonus of unifying the vibe between the traversal and the combat segments of the game much cleaner. Instead of suddenly pivoting between 2D and 3D every time you start and stop combat, it all feels like the same world and same characters because the models are no longer wildly different from each other. It makes revisiting this game feel fresh and like a new experience because the overhaul extends to many elements of the gameplay as well. For instance, literally all of the dungeons have been totally redesigned with new layouts and totally different puzzles. It's such a fundamental change that I kind of felt like I might as well have been playing a different installment in the Wild Arms series, but with the same story and characters. And that's really cool. There are definitely some remakes that should stay faithful to the original game, but I personally think that it's usually more fun to mix it up. The original version is still there if you suddenly get nostalgic for one of the old dungeons, but I found the new ones here to be at least as good. There's also the addition of the 30 puzzle box dungeons, which aren't quite dungeons, but present the player with a series of colored blocks that have to be pushed and pulled around in order to unlock a reward. Now, some of these are easy and some of these are crazy hard, but almost every single one of them introduces some new puzzle technique that changes things up. These felt slightly disconnected from everything else in this game, but that's actually why I was so cool with them. They're pretty good puzzles, and it was a nice break from the turn-based combat. Plus, I love puzzles. So when it comes to combat, things are largely the same as they are in the original version, with a couple of major changes. Firstly, there's the encounter cancel system, which apparently was a thing in Wild Arms 2 and 3, and allows the player to skip a random battle if they're not really feeling it. Okay, there's way more to it than just that, because skipping involves something called your migrant level, which is increased by collecting migrant seals, and makes it more difficult to skip harder fights. But even with those caveats, I'll just say it, every RPG should have something like this. Battles are great, but the option to just skip it, especially with a risk-reward element thrown in there, is pretty cool. When it comes down to completing a JRPG here on the show, we've gone back and forth on whether or not getting max level is required. Now, in most cases, I would say that getting max level isn't necessary. However, in Ultra Code F, you absolutely need to get max level with every character in the game. But fret not, my friends. There are ways to power level in Wild Arms Ultra Code F. Specifically, there are random enemies that are rare to fight known as apples, who provide experience based on how much damage you can do to them in one hit. They usually will run away at the start of a fight or have high hit evasion speeds, so it's hard to pull off a high damage move. However, using Rudy and his empty clip skill, plus all the buffs from other party members that can make him more powerful, he can empty an entire arm clip into an apple for a large amount of damage, which usually rounds up to almost 500,000 experience points every time. You'll get several levels after one fight, and it takes only a few minutes to find them. It's all RNG, but it's all awesome. I was grateful though, because this let me level up the characters super quickly. It also made up for a couple of elements that didn't survive the transition from the original to the remake, like equipable clothing items or apple varieties that would buff specific stats, or probably most notably, the infamous glitch that would suddenly grant your characters 255 copies of any item in the game that you can put in your inventory. A glitch that I used a lot last time around, but had to learn to survive without it in this version. Such is life. But it's time to talk about the biggest change of all, the one that drastically alters the entire completion process and adds a ton of playtime to the Wild Arms experience. I'm talking about the keys. a new collectible that also wraps up all of the other collectibles under its umbrella, creating a spider web of interlocking chores that slightly made me feel like I was starting to lose my mind. The keys almost act like this game's version of trophies or achievements in that they're mostly there to give you an incentive to explore everywhere, collect everything, level up everyone, identify all monsters in your bestiary, and fully upgrade every spell and ability in the game, if that's the sort of thing that you're into. And it happens to be exactly the sort of thing that I'm into, but it still ends up feeling like a lot. It meant finding every chest and every overworld item, fulfilling dispersing the fog of war, and revealing literally every pixel of the overworld map, getting each and every character all the way to level 100, which required a fair amount of grinding at the very least, but at least it was a bit easier thanks to this Apple exploit I explained earlier. And the bestiary itself is something that you just have to be aware of. You have to keep track of every boss and every enemy you fight and scan, and make sure they're collected in your bestiary. There are also keys tied to specific moments, like dealing a certain amount of damage to the final boss, which meant I had to make sure I knew ahead of time of what was being asked of me so I could prepare accordingly. Looking at the list of keys before I started, I was a bit worried, but it all ended up taking even longer than I imagined, especially that bestiary, which required me to scan and defeat every single monster in the game. This is normally the sort of thing that I would just look up ways to streamline, but the internet is absolutely covered in vague and mysterious posts about this game with varying levels of helpfulness. Like, one of the guides I was using didn't even mention the rarer monster spawns, which turned out to require hours and hours of grinding and RNG in the hopes that I would get the right monster to show up and then also scan it and beat it. Because there's nothing worse than finally finding the creature you've been praying for, only to lose and sit with the knowledge that you have to do this all over again. Trust me, I would freaking know. But I do want to give a quick shout outs to all of my Twitch mods who helped me complete this game, but more specifically Laharl and Bladevancer, who really cross-referenced a bunch of guides to make sure that I didn't get off the beaten track. There were so many opportunities for me to miss things, and those two helped me out a ton. Outside of the daunting task of getting all of the keys, Alter Code F is a remake that improves on basically every element of the original by not treating the original as sacred. It feels comfortable adding and removing things while knowing that the core elements like the tools, turn-based combat, and world of Filgaia are strong enough to maintain any nostalgia that the player might feel for the first game. The music, the storytelling, the visuals bring Wild Arms in line with the rest of the series that's on the PlayStation 2, and it allows the story's wild mix of anime, medieval Europe, and the Old West to cohere into something truly cool that genuinely makes me wish that the Wild Arms games were way more popular here in North America. Because even if it's often overshadowed by other RPGs, I kinda love Wild Arms. My arms is as wild as they've ever been, and they're showing no sign of slowing down.
Actually, I take it back. They're kind of starting to hurt. You couldn't see it, but they've been going wild off camera for this whole video so far. More like tired arms, am I right? Because my arms are tired. Leave me the f*** alone.
The original version of Wild Arms that I played didn't really have anything in the way of major completion rewards, which bummed me out a little bit at the time. But I guess I should be careful what I wish for, because that's basically what the entire key setup in Alter Code F is here to do. Provide steady rewards for each key, ultimately leading up to a gigantic completion experience. Amongst all the things I just described about completion with the EX keys, a few things I forgot to mention was that towards the end of the game, there are a few secret dungeons that you can explore and unlock. Note the words "you can explore and unlock," because we have to explore and unlock, as there are EX keys associated with bosses and items in these dungeons, especially the 100th floor dungeon. This dungeon is a beast. So many items, so many monsters for the bestiary, so many things to worry about in this massive 100th floor dungeon. It's so easy to get lost, not to mention a super hard boss fight is waiting for you at the end. Between a few dungeons like these, a few of these big bad bosses, and all of the other shit in this game, this work is going to be a lot. For your perspective, I put in 110 hours. That is a ton for a PlayStation 2 JRPG. Now, one of the rewards you get for getting the first key is you unlock EX New Game, which is basically New Game Plus. But the truth is, EX New Game Plus is designed for those of you out there who did not pay attention and get all of the EX keys in the first run. But after that, most of the keys you get will unlock either encyclopedia entries about the characters in the world, or illustration galleries full of concept art and behind the scenes stuff too, which is really cool considering how this game is not that popular. Some of the requirements don't necessarily feel worth it when you just get another gallery of images, but in general, it's dope that there is a reward for people out there who are super into Wild Arms. And honestly, if your name isn't the Completionist and you're unlocking all of the keys, then you're probably already super into Wild Arms, which would make all of that bonus material a neat incentive to check out each of the keys of your list. Because that's who completing Alter Code F is for, if I'm being completely honest. The fans of Wild Arms. As someone who played and enjoyed the original game, I mostly had a good time doing all the extra stuff because I was already invested and it was all brand new to me. But if this is how you're experiencing Wild Arms for the very first time, then I'm not so sure how much of an appeal there is here to be collecting all of those extra EX keys. Outside of that though, and if you're not worried about completion, I'd actually say Alter Code F is a great way to experience Wild Arms for the very first time, if only it were easier to find. Even though it's extremely different from the original, it mostly improves upon it in every way. And it's cool to know that if you're dying for more, there's another version out there with totally different dungeons, characters, moves, and so much more. While I completed Wild Arms Alter Code F, there were 2 deaths, which, to be honest, I am super proud of just by nature of the fact that there's so much more game this time around, which means there were way more opportunities to fail and have my party wiped. But once I used the Apple exploit to max everyone's level, it got pretty easy. And just like before, I basically stopped fearing death at all. 30 puzzle box dungeons solved, which doesn't have an equivalent from the last time because, well, they didn't exist. So I guess technically it's 30 more than I did last time, which sounds more impressive. So there you go. 25 EX keys found, which also entailed opening 382 treasure chests, collecting 32 crest graphs, and 20 migrant seals, dealing over 7,000 damage to the final boss. But for my troubles, I was rewarded with 18 image galleries, which is more than the nothing I got for completing the original game. 110 hours of total playtime, which is more than double the 50 or so it took me to complete the original version. It was a lot more work, and I think overall I'm glad that I decided to check this remake out this time around, just because, well, I love this game. And 3 physical copies of Wild Arms Alter Code F that I somehow have, but did not actually use for this episode. Now look, I'm not the biggest fan of emulation. I always strive to use original hardware or use hardware with clean looking upscaling technology. But sometimes, even just for a game to behave or look right, computers know what's up. But hey, it's good to know that if the channel ever falls apart, I have a future as a black market Wild Arms dealer. Oh wait, no, I didn't mean to say arms dealer, but black market Wild Arms dealer. Damn it, I said it again. You know what I mean.
So there you go, everyone. Instead of returning to Wild Arms classic PlayStation 1 style, I finally completed the much prettier, but much more involved Alter Code F remake. And I mostly feel good about it, even if my arms are still a little sore from how wild they got during this video. But having 2 versions of the game allows you to choose exactly how wild you want your own arms to be. Though I actually recommend Alter Code F if you're not planning to complete it. It's much prettier, with badass new art and music, and an insane amount of new puzzles, characters, collectibles, and overall a lot more content. I don't know if the keys are worth it unless you're already a big fan of the franchise looking to wring every last bit of content from the game, but if you want to experience the Wild Arms story for Wild Arms for the first time, this is definitely the way to do it. So, with that in mind, guys, I give this game my completionist rating of finish it.
Finish it!